Hi, and welcome to this webinar by the Active Cyber Defence Alliance on the topic of open source intelligence. I'm Andrew Cox, one of the steering group members of the Active Cyber Defence Alliance, and we're really glad to have you here today. We have an intention to foster Australia's adoption of active defence measures in the cyber realm, which we understand to cover intelligence, deception, active threat hunting, and lawful countermeasures. I stress the lawful. There's a lot that we can do within the law to defend ourselves. So this is the agenda of the Active Cyber Defence Alliance. I'll be co-hosting this session with my associate, Phil Moore, who will introduce himself a little later, who's our technical specialist. And we'll be taking questions and answers via the chat line through the session and having an interactive Q&A session at the end. So really welcome you today, and I believe you'll find this very interesting and stimulating. So let me introduce to you our panel today, where today's topic is really how open source intelligence applies during a cyber engagement. And we're going to really look at the whole sort of flow of an engagement and how it passes through. So we've got today two open source intelligence specialists from Australia's WorldStack, one of Australia's cyber intelligence businesses. And please welcome Dan Holman. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Andrew. My name is Dan, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of WorldStack. I've spent the last 10 years in cybersecurity on the technical advisory side, security engineering, threat intelligence, incident response, and design assurance. Previously, I was an analyst program sysadmin and solutions architect for IBM before joining Defence in 2010. I worked on some major cyber programs there, including JP 2068, Cyber Network Defence, 2047, which is Next Generation Network, and the Unified Secret Gateway, which was a project to combine several bilateral and Five Eyes network gateways into a single unified gateway at secret. I run the business with Eric, who's our head of intelligence and COO.
So let me introduce Eric Fleece, who's the Chief Operating Officer of WorldStack.
My name is Eric Fleece. I'm COO and co-founder of WorldStack. My background started in protective security and protective intelligence. I have a master's degree in policing, intelligence, and counterterrorism, and that's where my interest in open source intelligence came from. The past 12 or 13 years have been working in cybersecurity here in Canberra, and Dan and I founded WorldStack based out of our experience in the cybersecurity industry.
Welcome, Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So my name's Phil Moore. I've worked with Andrew at Avantgard for about 3 years now, and primarily manage Avantgard service delivery for the security products and services we represent and distribute and support. So I regularly contribute to the Active Cyber Defence Alliance and have authored and co-authored a number of ACDA cyber and threat intelligence papers, white papers, and contributed to the ACDA government submissions and policy recommendations through the Alliance. And it's great to be supporting the ACDA panel today with some of my contributions from experiences in the security domains. My background is in enterprise architecture in the infrastructure and security domain across IT, OT, and the communications areas. I've held senior technology and architecture roles over the past 20 years with leading US and Australian government organisations, including Telstra, Sun Microsystems, and with Australian government agencies, including Sydney Water, Transport for New South Wales, and a couple of federal government agencies as a consultant. So, prior to joining Avantgard, I was with Okta from about 2015 to 2019 to help build their professional services business in Australia and across the APAC region.
So Dan or Eric, what is your focus in the open source intelligence space? What's the motivation to make you think that there was scope for another entity doing this coming out of Australia?
So WorldStack's an intelligence company that specializes in open source intelligence with a strong background in cybersecurity. Our offerings span the cyber, human, and physical domains, and combine leading edge technology with expert human analysts to provide actionable intelligence for our clients. We're an Australian owned and operated company that was founded in 2014 out of a desire to leverage OSINT to do good. Our team is security cleared and come from backgrounds in cybersecurity, law enforcement, defence, and intelligence.
Okay, so Before we actually start the panel session today, I want to just give a very brief introduction to the Active Cyber Defense Alliance and who we are and what we do. First of all, we're a special interest group focused on fostering the adoption of active cyber defense, and I'll talk about what active cyber defense is in a minute. You'll find on our website, which I'll advertise to you somewhere through this presentation at acda.group, quite a lot of material, some of it government submissions, but some of it artifacts that be useful for practitioners. Reference standards for running a tender for intelligence, actually, for example, so you can actually understand how to specify a requirement effectively for these kinds of services. And anything that we produce is produced under Creative Commons. So we really want you to feel free to use the material that we create. And if it's of value to you, then it's in your hands to make the most of it. So that's our objective as an organization. We've just introduced Dan and Eric. Let me just give a very brief preamble to what we mean by active cyber defense. A friend of mine who's a retired intelligence officer said to me a couple of years ago, he said, Andrew, the way that the average organization is doing cybersecurity is like a blind boxer with both ears plugged in a boxing ring. He can't see what's coming at him and he can't hear it. He just reacts as best he can to the blows that land. And once in a while, he might land a lucky punch and manage to hurt his opponent. But basically, the chances of him being able to really win in an engagement like this is very poor, because it just doesn't have the visibility or the situational awareness of what he's defending against and does not have the initiative. So one of the things that got me involved in this space a few years ago was at the launch of Queensland University's cyber degree, and retired Major General Marcus Thompson got up as the guest speaker, and he had his 4 columns of cyber defense, and he describes self-defense as not having stupid passwords, not clicking on stupid links, and definitely not taking a selfie in front of the battle map when you're on maneuvers and posting it to Facebook, which apparently did happen a few years ago in a maneuvers. This is kind of, everybody has to do this. And then what he calls passive defense is the things that we, together with self-defense, call cybersecurity. So this is passwords, keeping your passwords complex, patching your systems so that they're not vulnerable to known faults, virus scanning, endpoint detection and response, through to the entire Essential 8, could go all the way through to whitelisting. Essentially passive measures. They don't give you visibility of what's coming at you. And the way that we've deployed them produces a massive flow of data, which people struggle to process. And then on the far right, we have the red zone, which is the offensive activity, which is exclusive to our security agencies. And certainly in the civilian sector, this is a complete no-go zone. The hackback area is a no-go zone. But in between them is this uncomfortable gray zone, which we call active defense, broadly made up of intelligence, deception, active threat hunting, and lawful countermeasures. Now, I stress the lawful, and we'll talk about that in another session. So this webinar series is really covering these 4 categories and looking at how they play into a cyber event, not just during the event, but in the before stage, how you could prepare before you're attacked to be in a posture that's going to enable you to hold the initiative rather than simply responding to somebody else. What you do during the attack and how you can use these tools and how they make a difference. And lastly, after the attack, in the recovery and the assurance phase and in the cleanup phase, how you can use proactive tools to get yourself again on the front foot rather than simply being reactive to events as they unfold. So that was the introduction. We're going to kick off really a freelancing discussion, but broadly around the structure of what intelligence really means, and then how it applies during these various phases. And we'll look at a couple of case studies on the way through and then wrap it up with some conclusions. So let me stop sharing my screen so we can start to talk to the individuals. I've given a brief introduction, guys, of what active cyber defense is. I'd be interested in your thoughts as to why we need it.
Oh, absolutely. So I think from my point of view, one of the easiest indicators is to look at how much time there is between a compromise and it being detected and then responding to it. So in the latest cost for data breach report from IBM and the Ponemon Institute, they're talking over 250 days. That's a significant amount of time for your data to be out in the wild before you detect it. And the other thing is that report also stated that it's highly likely that it'll be a third party that detects it. So in other words, there's also a risk that that data being out in the wild becomes public knowledge or taken up by the media, which obviously has implications for reputational damage.
So Phil, have you got a view as to why that is the case? Why aren't, I mean, we have detection tools in our networks. Why are these numbers so, well, unsatisfactory?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that's a really good question. From my operational security perspective and looking at how these cyber attacks have been evolving over a number of years, I think there's probably a number of factors. So firstly, you've got the more sophisticated threat actors, and it certainly appears that there's significant amounts of funding being provided to those malicious actors through not so friendly sovereign states. And that's led to quite sophisticated attacks, such as the SolarWinds attack, which really compromised, a trusted software supply chain. And what's worse, it compromised software that was actually designed to protect its clients and was compromised. So those customers were unwittingly installing that compromised software, thinking it was protecting them. And it would have been near impossible for traditional detection tools to pick this up. It's simply because it was regarded as trusted, and it was highly likely that in the configurations, that software would have been whitelisted. There's a strong view that this was, undetected, or the SolarWinds was undetected for many months, and possibly as long as 8 months. So then you've got the human element, where employees sign up for, for ancillary related services using their business email, and in many cases using the same or similar credentials as their work login credentials. Then if those external systems become compromised and attacked, basically those attackers get a free ride into the organization. On the other side, you've got many organisations that adopt a compliance-based operating model for their security. For example, it's common for Australian government agencies to maintain ISO 27001 certification or ISO 27000 certification, and then ongoing audits to maintain that compliance. So that model is more a checkbox type security model with very little proactivity. Approaches such as open source intelligence, in my experience, hasn't simply been a consideration for those agencies that I've been involved with anyway, and primarily because I think they're inwardly focused. In my view, they have a very much a castle moat mentality, in securing the perimeter, and that's okay, but it's not proactive or sufficient, especially for critical infrastructure.
I would just add to that, probably the major thing it provides doing active cyber defense is it allows organizations to get ahead of the curve. Phil just alluded to, we're not very proactive, and that's traditionally how cybersecurity has been, very reactive, running around putting out spot fires rather than doing something to get well ahead of the curve, plan for the future. They know what's coming down the pipeline. They're monitoring for things in real time outside of the network as well.
Okay. So to get to the theme of what we really want to discuss today, I'd like to have your view on, with the open source threat intelligence space, how can we get proactive in our adversary engagement so that we're not just reacting to somebody knocking on the door of our network and breaking in and become alerted once they're broken in, that we can get foreseeability of those events developing ahead of time?
Yeah, absolutely. So traditionally, threat intelligence has been more about looking at internally the network and what's happening on the wire, and a technical focus of what events are happening within the environment. Where we're looking at in terms of active cyber defense is also looking externally, because that's where you're going to find indicators of what's coming next. And by looking and understanding what threat actors are doing, but by understanding what the vulnerabilities that are coming down the pipe look like, by looking at the latest tools, techniques, and procedures, you can get a better sense of what you need to do in your organization to prevent incidents, but also to better detect them sooner, and to be able to respond more quickly when these incidents occur.
So one of the things that we saw in the Active Cyber Defense Alliance as we were developing these reference terms for specifying requirements for cyber threat intelligence was actually defining what we mean by intelligence, what qualifies as an alert even. Can you give a view on that, Eric?
Yeah, so I guess, traditionally, as Dan pointed out previously, threat intelligence has been looking internally, and if you'd gone around and looked at what some vendors were providing as threat intelligence, it would just be, bad IP addresses. That's not really answering questions that intelligence needs to answer, right? It needs to answer the who, what, when, where, why, and how. That's intelligence. It's got context. It allows, an end user of that intelligence to know what it's about, what they need to do, how they need to do it, where traditionally that is not the way threat intelligence had been done.
I would add that, threat intelligence in that form, threat feeds, they'll give you feeds of things that are happening, indicators of compromise, as Eric pointed out, bad IPs, bad hashes, bad domains, etc. But how much of that is actually relevant to your organization, and how many of those indicators of compromise are potentially for things that are no longer a threat to your organization? Research suggests that threats, vulnerabilities are really only something that you need to be concerned about in terms of a certain window. So something that was a vulnerability 10 years ago is more than likely to have been patched or no longer an issue for you. So with limited resources, you need to focus on what are the threats that are relevant to me and to my organization right now, rather than how many things can I subscribe to, because that creates a different problem, which is I've got all this data, how do I know which one's relevant to me? And you have a filtering problem, which funnily enough, that's what we have with security information event management systems and logging systems, right? The idea was have everything log and send it to a central place, and then we're supposed to run some rules over it to try and work out what the bad ones are. There's all different sorts of approaches to that, but you end up creating the same sorts of problems. And so our approach is different. It's more about understanding the organization and what technologies it has, to then tailor the intelligence that's provided to be very specific to that organization, and to make sure that everything we're providing is actionable. It's not just, here's some bad things you need to add to a file. We'll explain to you why you need to do that.
So Dan, if in a situation where, and you hear this term drinking from the fire hose, and the very large numbers of, data points that come into a typical SIEM or SOC, particularly if they're logging most of the infrastructure. And in your case, I understand you're actually going outside of that and looking at a massive data stream coming in from the wild. Mm-hmm. How is it that you're able to deal with that differently from a typical SOC analyst? How does your intelligence analytical process, or an effective analytical process, differ from that? Yeah,
so we use a combination of technology and human analysts to produce our intelligence. So we've built a capability, including a threat intelligence platform that's able to source intelligence based on topics of interest for threat intelligence, like threat actors, data breaches, credential leakages, and the like. And then what we're doing is, for all that data that we're collecting that's relevant to something that our clients would be concerned about, we're then running AI and ML-enabled classification systems over that data with indicators that we have already trained the system with, to be able to say, this is something that will be of concern. And then we highlight that as a threat in the system, and our human analysts then triage that threat, enrich it with context, answering that intelligence question before it's sent to the client. And that also includes filtering out anything that's actually a false positive. So, obviously within any system, a detection system, it has a false positive rate, and there is a tuning process. And so we have a human in the loop to make sure that anything that goes through to the client is absolutely something they need to be aware of or action.
Okay. So let's come then to the question of in the before phase. What do you think are the things that an organization could and should be doing to enable themselves to get ahead of the game? Have we covered that satisfactorily, or you've got some other thoughts?
No, look, I don't think so. So when you think about it, most organizations' cyber capability beyond ticking the compliance boxes includes, log monitoring. Is usually the next step, right? So let's enable all of our systems to log and send to a central repository, and then we're trying to detect threats by having a SIEM or some other similar sort of system. XDR, SOAR is some of the later technologies looking at this problem. I guess the difference there is that most of those approaches are only looking at all of that data that's coming internally. What you need to also be doing is grabbing data externally and having that, I guess, matched against the data you have internally to I guess, understand threats, both that might already be in your environment, but also what's coming down the pipe, so you can better prepare for those threats. When you think about who's operating those SIEMs, there's usually teams of analysts. So they're triaging threats that are surfaced by the security information event management systems. And they're trying to make decisions about, is this something we need to do something about or not? How serious is this? It's a triage process. And so one of the things that threat intelligence should be providing you is advance notice of a situational awareness of the threat landscape, such that those analysts are making better, more informed and faster decisions about what is a threat. And what that really directly leads to is faster detection times, faster response times, and therefore minimizing impact.
So how does the intelligence feed and the analysts that are doing that work to prepare that intelligence feed differ from what a SOC analyst does?
Yeah, look, SOC analysts are some of the most overworked people there are in an organization. They're, a day in the life of a SOC analyst, they're going through hundreds of alerts every day, and a lot of them start to blur and look the same. Human error starts to sort of creep in to an extent, and there's a large burnout rate for those analysts. So at what point, do they get time to go and research the latest threats and read about, the latest vulnerabilities or any of that kind of thing? I think organizations will have this idea that all their analysts are doing this, and then that they're all fully across the threat picture, but that's very unlikely to be the case. And so when you look at the maturity level of organizations with regard to security operations, often the evolution of the security operations capability after the one that I described earlier, which is, you've got log management and you've got a SIEM and you've got some analysts looking at the logs, and you've got IDSs and things feeding in and detection rules firing, and you've got analysts triaging those and so on, is you actually stand up your own intelligence cell. And the purpose of the intelligence cell is really to take an intelligence focus on the detection, but also to look internally and externally to understand what's going on and feed that through regular briefings to the analyst team. And so, obviously a threat intelligence capability can be deployed internally, or you can use a service provider, and there are pros and cons of both approaches. And using a service provider can be a way to get access to a capability for I guess, something that's more affordable.
So Eric, just to throw the question to you, in thinking about this before phase, can you give some examples from life of incidents where open source intelligence was able to really enable a client to get ahead of something or defeat an attack before it was able to be developed?
Would liken it to when I worked in protective security, so that there's a common theme there where we would before an attack, what you're really looking for is strategic level intelligence. So you're looking over the horizon at, what's coming down the pipeline, what should we be planning for, whether that's related to a threat actor or vulnerabilities, and getting ahead of the curve, as we discussed before. I remember in protective security, working in the financial institutions, that we would see, say, certain style of attacks on ATMs, whether it was skimming devices or blowing ATMs up. There was generally a lag period between where that would happen first, say in Europe or the US, and then it would take, in the physical world, that would take 1.5 to 2 years to make its way here to Australia. Now, in the cyber world, that's a much quicker time period. It's compressed, so it can almost be immediately. So the biggest thing is looking over the horizon and planning, understanding your crown jewels. What are they going to be after in terms of your organization as well? It could be, if you're a target for a nation state, obviously, understanding your crown jewels is pertinent to protecting them. Whereas if it's just a script kiddie attack, you could just be a sort of a random choice of target. In any case, that I guess foresight from strategic intelligence helps prepare for those and protect.
Yeah, absolutely agree, Eric. One of the values of having a good threat intelligence solution in place, and often underestimated in my view, is that the very nature of having that intelligence coming through to your organisation actually lifts the confidence of your security analysts, especially when you do uncover either an emerging threat or evidence of your organisation being targeted, or in the case of loss of any organisational data being detected anywhere in the wild that shouldn't be there. Although it's concerning, it's actually a hugely positive outcome. And how often do we hear an executive or maybe a government minister in the media after an organisation or agency has either been found to have been compromised, or maybe after being outed by and exposed by a third party, and the public relations spin is, we have no evidence that data has been stolen. Well, seriously, if they don't have tools or mechanisms in place to detect loss or exfiltration of that data, then sure, there won't be any evidence, because there's no methods or tools that could detect that loss and provide the evidence. So from a data loss and intelligence perspective, especially where sensitive documents or data or intellectual property, which is really part of your organisation's crown jewels, are involved, that's where having active data loss or data leakage intelligence tools such as file beaconing or checking the dark web for known data or document signature hashes adds significant value to those proactive detections and warning signs for an organisation.
We've either detected something coming at us, but come what may, they've been able to breach our perimeter, or they've been able to compromise some of our clients' equipment, or maybe they've been able to bribe somebody to give them a master password and user credentials. What do we do now? How does open source intelligence play once the adversary is already inside of my infrastructure, inside of my assets?
Yeah, so typically what we see here is in incident response, the team is looking for information. So that something is fired. Either they've been told that something's happened from a third party, or one of their detection systems has fired, and they're investigating. They're trying to understand, well, is this something we need to be concerned about? How concerned? What action do we need to take? And so as part of that, you can rely on an intelligence capability to provide information on, okay, we found this, what does it mean? Is this something we should be concerned about? And often organizations don't have that kind of capability inside their team. So incident response teams are typically focused on things like digital forensics and the like. They're very often not intelligence focused. And so, having the ability to say, okay, I found this IP address doing these behaviors. Is that linked to a known threat actor? Or we're seeing this pattern of behavior on this endpoint. What is that representative of in terms of a particular threat or malware group? We've seen these spear phishing emails. Is this something that is targeted? Is this just a drive-by? Is this a pattern of behavior against our organization suggests that we're being targeted by someone? These are the sorts of things that an intelligence cell can provide you over and above directly responding to whatever the specific threat is during an incident response.
And how is it that they're able to do that, Dan or Eric?
Our platform, for example, is collecting information from various different sources, whether it's technical information or from blogs, the dark web, and it's aggregating that, right, becomes fused intelligence, and then the analyst is actually looking at that and reviewing the content. So I think we mentioned before about, I think Dan may have mentioned that internal information, and now we're looking external. You've actually got to bring those together at some point. So, our analysts may be giving a task from a client that has seen an IOC or a TTP. It could start with either of those. One, they may see a behavior happening at the perimeter that they want to understand better, or it could be an IOC as an IP address or a file hash or whatever it may be. And then the analysts are looking at it from an intelligence perspective and sort of reverse engineering from there and going backwards, right? Well, who's known to use, that particular tool set? Who's known to go after that particular sector? Have we seen any activity in that particular sector that matches that? And then provide that back to the client. They'll then look at that in conjunction with the information they have from the internal network. And you'll build a much clearer picture of who may be targeting or who has targeted your organization.
So what competencies do your analysts have that a typical SOC analyst doesn't have?
I would say SOC analysts in general, by and large, are much more focused on technical aspects of cybersecurity. So network security, packet capture, those kinds of things. Intelligence analysts approach everything from an intelligence lifecycle standpoint. So they operate a bit differently. They're not interested in pulling apart a piece of malware and understanding how it works on a network. They're more interested in the who, what, when, where, why, attributes that we discussed earlier on, and understanding that, providing that back to the client.
So when you say an intelligence cycle, what does that mean?
Generally got a process related to the intelligence, So, it starts at understanding your requirements. What are the requirements for intelligence? And then it goes to, collection, analysis, reporting, dissemination. There's various different models, but roughly that's how the intelligence lifecycle operates. And then there's, of course, always the feedback loop. Once you report it, then you're assessing where it's at and starting that process all over again, basically.
And there's different levels of intelligence as well. So cycles can happen at strategic, operational, tactical levels. So typically strategic intelligence is looking at, as Eric mentioned it, over the horizon, things that are coming, big picture threats. Operational intelligence is looking at what might be happening in terms of a campaign this year. And tactical intelligence is what's happening this week or today in terms of action we need to take or events that are occurring that the client needs to understand and be made aware of.
Interesting that you say what you're talking about, Eric, in terms of, that life cycle of intelligence, background with incident response at some government organisations in, a SOC perspective, they very rarely actually have that life cycle in front of them. It's all reactive in terms of, we've had an incident. Let's look at the technical side of what's happening in the incident rather than looking at it from a true life cycle of intelligence.
That goes back to, I think I mentioned it before, running around and dealing with what's right in front of them now. Like, there's been an incident, we need to respond to that. Rather than, being able to have the time to look outwards and be more proactive.
A preliminary conversation, we were talking about the Lapsus group and some of the breaches which they claimed to be their work. How does the open source intelligence play into enabling an organization to defend itself against a group like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as part of that ongoing intelligence collection regarding threat actors, part of that is identifying new threat actor groups, and with those threat actor groups, new or different tools, techniques, and procedures. And this is where it becomes very important for an organization in terms of understanding those new tools, techniques, and procedures, because often they will circumvent or defeat existing security controls. So in the case of Lapsus, there's heavy use of social engineering and bypassing of multi-factor authentication through brute forcing and attacks in the browser. So these are not novel threats, but the combination of them into a new attack pattern is different and new. And so by understanding these, I guess, ahead of time, organizations can start thinking about what they might need to do in order to better manage and prevent incidents related to these new TTPs. In the case of Lapsus Grid, it might be things like creating and delivering an awareness campaign to your users to make them specifically aware of new attacks in the browser and brute force attacks to multi-factor authentication. And so by making users aware of these sorts of things, they become more open and potentially don't just click the OK button on the brute force multi-factor attack, and they'll instead report it to the security organization. And so, and then that becomes another part of feeding the intelligence cycle, right? So was this an opportunistic attack? Was this something targeting our organization? And when users start reporting that in patterns of behavior, you start thinking, this is not an isolated incident. Someone's trying to get access to our information. There must be something behind this. And then you might perhaps spin out another intelligence cycle to understand more about that. But I guess in terms of practically, how does intelligence help you deal with new threats? It's more what I just described before. By understanding what's new and different, you can then decide and take action about what you need to do to better prepare your organization, to better detect that, to better, I guess, respond to that, and to clean it up sooner and minimizing that impact and damage.
So a number of times through the conversation today, you've referred to tools, techniques, and procedures, and being able to identify an adversary and know what to expect from them, which sort of, while you're saying that, I'm thinking that sounds rather like the MITRE ATT&CK framework.
Mm.
But so can you explain to me how an open source intelligence service differentiates from the MITRE ATT&CK framework per se?
Yeah, look, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a great framework. And there are a number of frameworks out there that are useful in the intelligence, I guess, capability. And we do include MITRE ATT&CK in our intelligence products. But there is no one framework to rule them all. And I think you need to think about the best framework for the particular situation that you're trying to deal with. And intelligence is a number of different things that you need to consider. And whilst the MITRE ATT&CK framework is very robust and a great framework, I think you also need to include and consider other frameworks and other methods of understanding and communicating threat intelligence.
So I'm sort of taking it that in a sense they're synergistic, because you're really trying to bring in up-to-date information, maybe from this week or last week forward, that's relevant, whereas those frameworks might be somewhat more static.
Absolutely. As with anything like that, there's a process for updating them, and in that process for updating, there's time elapsed, and so there can be a delta between that framework and what's happening right now. So there might be attacks and TTPs that are happening right now that are not even in that framework yet. So you need other ways to be able to describe those kinds of things. And the same sort of thing applies to vulnerabilities. So, the National Vulnerability Database is a great resource, and we use it as part of our intelligence capability. But typically it takes somewhere, around a month for a vulnerability to be reported into that database. That's a long time for something to be in the wild and potentially being used against your organization before it gets picked up and then communicated to you. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's another important reason why you should have a threat intelligence service that's not just looking at NVD and other online databases, because they might not be the most up-to-date information. And so what we do to close that loop is we're constantly monitoring, hacker forums, the dark web, and other places where we can discover information about new and novel techniques, such as zero-day exploits. And what we then do is we look to create proof of concepts for those exploits as quickly as we can, and then be able to share that with clients. And so where, for example, an exploit affects a client and they have a technology that is affected, we can pretty quickly tell them that it is affected, and that's part of I guess attack surface intelligence. But more specifically as well, it will give you an understanding of a potential vulnerability that before it ever gets to the MVD. So you might find out from us that there's a 0-day vulnerability that you should be aware of within a matter of the same day or hours, versus if you wait for it to come through MVD, you might be waiting a month. That is a big difference in terms of your ability to prevent and act before an incident occurs.
Okay, so we talked about the before and the during. What about the after phase? Where does OSINT play in the cleanup and assurance and recovery phase?
I would say there's probably two main use cases. One is obviously trying to understand what occurred, why, and who the threat actor was. So that gives context to that. But there's also the monitoring side of things, so if there's a data breach or, it's a ransomware attack, there's certain things we can do to set up monitoring to detect whether your data has been leaked, or if a particular threat actor group has claimed responsibility for that data breach, for example. They're probably the two main areas that I would say in the after, which we've seen used through our services.
So if I get information that my data has been leaked, and you've got some visibility of where it's been leaked or where it's available, what can I do now?
Yeah, so that will depend obviously on the platform it's leaked to. If it's leaked to a website where there's an admin that you can contact and ask for that file to be removed, say from a file sharing website, we work with clients to help them understand what that process is for that particular platform. In other cases, it's just understanding that it's out there. If it's leaked to a dark web website, there's pretty much zero chance you're going to get it pulled down. So you need to actually understand, well, what data was leaked? What do we have to advise the client to do? Was it a particular set of user accounts where they have to force a password reset, for example? So that's pretty much, all you can do when it comes to something like the dark web, whereas, on file share sites or paste sites, generally you can request that data be pulled down. Social media, you can do the same, request for that data to be pulled down. We've quite often had to work with legal teams on the client side. So once we identify something, say a file dump, data's been leaked to a particular website, aside from the dark web, generally those requests to take data down have to come from a legal department. It'll be a legal request. Most legal teams aren't used to dealing with that particular scenario. So it's generally us working with them to advise them, these are the steps you need to take to have that data removed.
So I've got a mandate from my organization. I'm convinced I've got a budget, and I'm a CISO, or I'm a senior architect, and I'm going to specify a threat intelligence service. What sort of considerations should I be thinking about as I specify what I want to acquire?
Well, I think you need to understand what you're actually trying to achieve with your threat intelligence service. So I think most people, I guess from our experience working with clients, is they understand threat intelligence can help them get IOCs to put into a firewall or into an IDS and to get rule sets like that. But when you start thinking about what threat intelligence can provide in terms of understanding threats actors and threats against your organization, specifically your technology stack, then you can start to actually think about how, from an ROI and metrics point of view of demonstrating the value of your threat intelligence capability, one of the things you want to be looking for is, how do I track what is actually happening in terms of threats against me, vulnerabilities, attack surface. And so your threat intelligence capability can give you those metrics. And so one of the things I think is really important when you're assessing threat intelligence capabilities to understand, well, how will this help me understand and to justify expenditure in cybersecurity? The other thing that people I think don't generally think about is threat intelligence can really give you some good feedback on your existing security controls and spend, how effective they are. I think people would be surprised to find that even once you've deployed all of the compliance-based tools, your endpoint protection, your logging, your identity access management, or privileged access management, that there's still a large gap that's there, and there is no possible way to defend against it all. So threat intelligence should be used as a way to understand what is the gap. Where should we be deploying our next resources? Because everyone's struggling with limited resources, and a top question is, all right, well, where do we spend it? And I think you should be looking for a threat intelligence capability can help answer that question. Obviously, you're also looking for that they're providing a really good feed of relevant information that is the actionable information that provides context about what is this threat, what does it mean to be, why should I be concerned about it, what do I need to do about it? There are a number of different aspects to threat intelligence, and where I think I mentioned earlier, where previously it was really technically focused, IP addresses, malware hashes, etc. Now we're also looking at cybersecurity getting involved in brand and reputation, third-party risk and supply chain risk, geopolitical risk. The security functions, which were typically separate cyber personnel and physical or protective security, there's a convergence happening. So, you should also be considering, how can my threat intelligence capability help my fellow, security organizations inside my organization? What we're seeing now is threat intelligence capabilities branching out to provide more than just information on technical threats or cyber threats, but also looking at those protective and also human domains. And so that's something we focused on, and we recognized that trend early on. Ultimately, cyber threats involve humans, and humans obviously are in offices and things like that. So that's where your geopolitical and asset-based risks come from. And so they're all intertwined. And really, in terms of an overall intelligence capability, you should be looking at it holistically as an organization.
I was just going to say that goes to the heart of, intelligence gathering and sharing. I mean, traditionally, whether it's cybersecurity or intelligence for counterterrorism, it's always been a siloed approach, right? No one wants to share their information. And that was highlighted after the 9/11 attacks, where they found that everyone had separate slices of the puzzle, but no one was actually sharing information to get a view across everything. And it's similar in cybersecurity as well. No one wants to share that they had an incident and they found these particular IOCs related to it, because they don't want anyone to know they've had an incident potentially. Yeah, part of that from the banking sector, where we had basically a banking association security group where we would meet periodically and share, what we were seeing across our different, banking businesses, whether it's, retail banking, insurance and so forth. We would meet regularly and discuss what we were seeing. But that was still sometimes like playing a game of poker. No one wanted to show their hand first.
So just going back to the conversation around geopolitical risk, and we're talking about considerations for procuring a threat intelligence capability. How much difference does it make where the country of origin of the intelligence? Is there a flavor of American versus British versus Israeli versus Indian versus Australian threat intelligence service providers?
Yeah, absolutely, there is. So just talking, regard to the other conversation we were having, I guess what I wanted to add was, it's important when you're looking at a threat intelligence provider that they're giving you intelligence that's relevant to your particular industry and region. So you'll be looking for a provider that's familiar with your region, the threats against it, and your industry. And that applies for looking at US-based capability being applicable to Australia, or Australian capability being applicable to Europe or Asia. So you do need to look for the right capability to suit your organization. And furthermore, I would add that you should be looking for a capability that's able to provide tailored and specific threat intelligence, not just a fire hose of threat feeds. Right, because the fire hose of threat feeds is just going to make a problem for you, where you're going to have to then filter all of that information to try and work out what's relevant to you. And what ends up happening is similar to log management systems. It will just build up and nobody will look at it. And so you end up paying a fee for intelligence feeds and you get no value from it.
Yep.
Because no one's looking at it. There's just too much information there. And so you need to be looking at how much volume of intelligence you're going to get and making sure you're only consuming what you can actually manage within your organization. So yeah, I think there are a couple of other important considerations when you're looking at a threat intelligence capability.
Go on, Eric.
I would also add that, you know, in terms of the capability itself, looking at the, you know, where is this platform providing data from and about? So it's no good if you need information on what threat actors are doing to, you know, a particular sector in Australia, but the platform is not getting data from relevant data sources, as in the threat actors aren't active on those platforms. That's not where they interact, right? Like, for example, you know, if you were looking for threats to Australia, you wouldn't look at something like, say, Foursquare in terms of social media, because the threat actors probably aren't going to be present on that platform that you're really interested in. And so you're paying for, as part of a threat intelligence platform, data consumption. You're just adding to your cost by getting information from those data sources when you don't really need it.
So just to close off there, because our time is really gone, you know, we hear a lot of people, and me included, bewailing that we do a compliance-based approach to security. Everybody's so busy just meeting their compliance obligations that their budget gets consumed without necessarily looking at the performance outcomes that those investments are making. So then we see the trend towards risk-based security and prioritizing, assessing your risks and then prioritizing your investments to address the risks. And then we're talking more about an active defense, which is really trying to get ahead of the curve. How do you determine the priority with which you invest in these various strategies? Any thoughts there?
Well, I think it needs to be fed by what's actually facing your particular organization, because that answer is different for every organization. It depends on what your organization's doing, what your strategies are, because it's not just what you're doing now, it's also what is your business heading towards and what would those future threats be. But the threats are different depending on the region you're operating in, but also the industry that you're in. And so your threat intelligence needs to consider those factors, and that should be feeding into your decision-making framework about where you allocate resources. And really that should be also how you get informed about your compliance. So, you know, in most compliance frameworks, there's a way to say there's mitigating controls. And so if you can use threat intelligence to inform you about the actual threats, and you say, okay, that compliance control is required, but actually when you think about it from a risk point of view, we understand based on this current intelligence that this is a bigger threat and therefore a bigger risk to us, and we should be doing something about this first. So a recent example I can think of is a particular industry has an issue with insider threat and whistleblowing, and they needed to understand, they were having data leaks, and they need to understand, where's this data leak coming from? And so that rather than implementing compliance-based cybersecurity methods, they switched tack and they said, we need proactive intelligence capabilities to be able to find out where this insider threat's coming from. And so, you know, they looked at database deception content, putting traps around the organization to then be able to understand who's accessing what content, because as Phil alluded to earlier, a lot of our cybersecurity systems are set to find and detect abnormalities, but not really to detect abnormal behavior for privileged users or approved users. So if you have particular data that you're trying to protect, how do you know who's accessed it without somehow instrumenting that I guess, asset you're trying to protect, to inform you that something's happened to that asset that you need to be responding to. And in the case of, I guess, understanding where data leaks are coming from, that's one way to solve that problem. You have to think outside of the compliance box to solve that problem.
Actually, it reminds me of what I heard somebody say, that deception is a means of acquiring intelligence that you can't acquire by any other means. The intelligence that your adversary most doesn't want to disclose to you.
what would be considered the best forms of intelligence in a human intelligence context. And we talked about, ultimately humans being behind cyber attacks. The best form is human intelligence, right? I recruit someone, they tell me what's going on, or they give me a document which tells me what's going on. If you think about active cyber defense in that context, whether that's honey tokens or infiltrating, cyber threat actor groups and getting that firsthand information, active cyber defense actually gets you that information you need, just like a human intelligence source would.
So that's really, I've got to thank you for the segue, because we do have an upcoming webinar on the application of deception in the before, during and after phase of an attack. So watch this space for that. But I think on the topic of open source intelligence, we really appreciate your contribution today. And Dan and Eric and Phil, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And the next slide will show you our website address and email address for the Active Cyber Defense Alliance. If you'd like to ask more, know more about how you can get hold of some of these approaches and some of the sources of information that are available, you can find that on our website. And we look forward to engaging you guys. And see you all at ACER in October.